Sorcha dropped to her knees beside the wounded man without a single thought for the dragon still trembling with fury 3 feet away, because that was the whole of her training, the whole of what she had built her entire adult life to be capable of doing without flinching. She pressed a folded cloth hard against the wound and called for pressure, for water, for the runner boy to fetch the surgeon, and only once the bleeding had slowed to something survivable did she let herself look up at the creature who had caused it. Vesper was not looking at the man he had injured. He was looking at her. I think it is worth saying, before anything else about this story, that Sorcha had bandaged 11 riders before this one, over the course of a single brutal season, and that every single time, Vesper had gone still the moment her hands touched a wound he had made. He did not attack her. He did not so much as growl in her direction. He simply watched, amber eyes fixed and unreadable, while she undid whatever damage his fear and fury had just done, and no one in the Corps had yet found the pattern worth mentioning aloud. 12, said Commander Cassian's voice from the edge of the yard, flat and controlled in a way that did nothing to hide the exhaustion underneath it. 12 riders in one season, Sorcha, and I am the one who has to explain each one to the Emperor's council. He crossed the yard toward her, tall and travel-worn, his eyes moving from the wounded man to the still trembling dragon, to Sorcha herself, with an expression she had learned, over 3 years working beside him, to recognize as a man counting costs he did not want to count. There is not going to be a 13th attempt. If this dragon cannot be bonded, the council has already decided what happens to him instead. Sorcha looked past Cassian's shoulder at Vesper, still holding his defensive stance at the center of the yard, wings trembling now from exhaustion rather than fury, and felt something in her chest twist tight at the thought of what the council's decision would actually mean. She had seen dragons culled before, twice in her 3 years with the Corps, and both times, the animal in question had genuinely earned the sentence through unprovoked violence that left no room for doubt. Vesper had never once, in 12 encounters, struck first. She opened her mouth to say so, and then closed it again, watching the wounded rider being carried off on a stretcher, understanding that grief and politics rarely left much room for anyone to hear an inconvenient truth. Sorcha had joined the Dragon Corps as a healer at 19, 3 years after a wild dragon's territorial strike had killed her father on a border survey he should never have volunteered for, and she had told herself, standing at his graveside, that she would spend her life on the side of the wound, rather than the side of the weapon. It was a decision that made sense to no one in her family, who could not understand why a woman who had lost so much to dragons would choose to spend her days with hands full of their blood, and Sorcha had never found a way to explain it that satisfied them, because the truth was simpler and stranger than grief. She did not blame the dragons. She blamed the carelessness of people who approached them without earning the right to. Cassian had been master of riders for the whole 3 years she had worked the Corps grounds, a position that made him responsible for every bonding attempt and every failure that followed it, and Sorcha had watched him grow more guarded with each season that passed, his easy early warmth replaced by the particular caution of a man who had learned that hope cost more than it returned. She did not know, in her 3rd year working beside him, that he had lost a close friend to a bond gone wrong 5 years earlier, a rider who had forced connection with a dragon unwilling to give it, and paid with his life for the mistake. She knew only that Cassian carried himself like a man perpetually bracing for the next report of blood. "You do not actually believe he cannot be bonded," she said to him now, quiet enough that the runner boy hauling water could not overhear it. "I have watched 12 attempts, Cassian. He does not attack out of malice. He attacks because every single rider the Corps has sent at him has come in with a rope, a claim, and no patience at all for anything he might actually want." Cassian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something older and more tired than command authority moved across his face. "I do not have the luxury of believing anything that is not in a report," he said, low. "The council wants results, or they want him gone, and I have run out of ways to buy him more time." She thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over while she restocked her satchel and checked on the 12th rider's recovery, and found herself circling back to the particular exhaustion in Cassian's voice more than the words themselves. 3 years of working beside him had taught her that his caution was not indifference, however much it sometimes looked that way from the outside, and she wondered, not for the first time, what exactly had happened to a man who had once, according to the older healers, been the most hopeful officer the Corps had ever trained. Whatever it was, he had buried it deep enough that she had never once seen it surface in 3 years of working at his side. She found Vesper 2 nights later in the far corner of the north enclosure, favoring one foreleg in a way he had been hiding from the daytime handlers, and when she knelt to examine the swollen joint, she discovered a deep puncture wound gone hot and infected beneath the scale, the kind of injury a dragon inflicted on himself, thrashing against a rope he had never agreed to wear. He should have torn her hand off for touching it. Every training manual she had ever read insisted an infected, defensive dragon was the most dangerous kind there was. Vesper simply went still, the same total stillness he offered every time her hands found a wound he had made, and let her clean the puncture and pack it with crushed feverfew without a single warning growl. "You do this every time," she murmured to him, working carefully in the dark, with only a shielded lantern for light, unwilling to risk drawing the attention of handlers who would report an unauthorized approach as recklessness, rather than the careful, patient work it actually was. "You let every rider who comes at you with a rope tear pieces off each other, and then you let me undo it afterward, like I'm the only person in this whole Corps who's ever asked you what you actually wanted first." Vesper's head turned to watch her work, slow and deliberate, amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the hair on her arms rise despite the gentleness of the moment. He made a low sound in his chest, not quite a growl, closer to something she had started privately calling his listening sound, the noise he made only when she talked through her thoughts aloud while treating him. She had come to depend on that sound more than she wanted to examine too closely. "I don't know how to save you if the council decides you're a liability," she admitted, quiet and honest in the dark. "I only know how to bandage what's already broken. I don't know how to convince 12 reports full of blood that none of it was your fault to begin with." Vesper lowered his massive head until it rested near her knee, heavy and warm, and held that position long enough that Sorcha finally let herself lean into it, some fear in her chest easing for the first time in weeks. She stayed longer than she meant to that night, long enough that the moon crossed most of the sky above the enclosure, before she finally forced herself to rise, her knees stiff from the cold stone floor, and her heart oddly reluctant to leave. Vesper watched her gather her satchel with the same patient attention he gave every part of her visits, and when she paused at the enclosure gate to look back at him one last time, she found she could not quite name the feeling settling low in her chest. It did not feel like the professional satisfaction of a healer who had done her job well. It felt closer to the particular ache of leaving something behind that she had already, without quite deciding to, begun to love. Cassian found her there an hour later, having noticed her absence from the healer's quarters, and followed instinct rather than evidence to the north enclosure, and stood frozen at the sight of Sorcha asleep against the flank of the very dragon the council had just voted to condemn, her lantern burned down to embers beside her. He did not wake her immediately. He stood in the dark for a long moment, studying the impossible calm of a creature that had maimed 12 trained riders in a single season, now curled protectively around an unarmed woman who had broken at least 4 separate Corps regulations to be there. He woke her carefully, and listened, for the first time in 3 exhausting years, to the full account she had been trying to give him in fragments all season, the pattern of Vesper's stillness under her hands, the self-inflicted wounds he hid from the daytime handlers, the specific, deliberate restraint of a dragon who had never once, in 12 violent encounters, injured anyone who was not actively trying to force a rope over his neck. "I pulled the surgeon's records myself last week," Cassian admitted, low, sitting beside her in the dark for the first time as something other than her commanding officer. Every wound Vesper caused was defensive. Not one rider approached him the way the bonding manuals actually require. Someone has been sending riders in fast and rough on purpose. Sorcha felt something cold settle in her stomach at the implication. "Sending them in wrong on purpose," she repeated. Why would anyone want 12 failed attempts logged against him? Cassian's expression darkened with an anger she had never seen from him before. controlled and precise. Because Lord Ashby has been petitioning the council for Vesper's nesting territory for 2 years, he said, a dangerous, unbondable dragon gets culled. A culled dragon's territory gets reassigned. I did not want to believe a member of this council would manufacture 12 injuries to clear land, but I cannot find another explanation that fits every report I have just read. Sorcha sat with that revelation for a long moment, watching Cassian's careful composure fray at the edges in a way she had never witnessed before, and felt her own anger rise to match his. 12 men were hurt, she said quietly, and a dragon nearly lost everything, because one lord wanted better grazing land. Cassian nodded once, grim. I intend to prove it, he said, but proof of this kind takes time we may not have, and I am not yet certain who else on the council might already be receiving Ashby's coin to look the other way. The weight of that uncertainty settled over both of them, turning what had been a quiet, hopeful night into something considerably more dangerous. The proof came sooner and worse than either of them expected. 3 nights later, when Sorcha arrived for her evening check to find Vesper collapsed on his side, breathing in shallow, labored pulls, foam gathering at the corner of his jaw in a way that had nothing to do with any infection she had treated before. She tested the water trough with trembling hands and found the bitter, unmistakable residue of nightroot, a poison slow enough to look like natural decline and fast enough, in the dose someone had used, to kill a dragon his size within a day. Cassian! She was screaming his name before she had fully processed the decision to run for him, and he came at a dead sprint from across the grounds, taking in the scene in a single horrified glance before dropping to his knees beside her without a moment's hesitation for rank or protocol. Together, they worked through the worst night either of them had lived through in years, forcing charcoal slurry down a throat too weak to swallow properly, packing him with every counter-herb the healer's stores contained, and losing, more than once, the argument against believing they were about to watch him die. You do not get to do this, Sorcha told Vesper somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, her voice cracking, both hands pressed flat against his chest, to feel for a pulse gone thin and unsteady. 12 riders survived you, and you do not get to die from someone's poison instead. I did not spend a whole season proving you were never the danger, just to lose this argument to a coward with a vial. Cassian's hand found hers in the dark, steadying rather than commanding, and for the first time in 3 years of careful professional distance, neither of them pulled away from the contact. Vesper's breathing steadied toward dawn, ragged but holding, and Sorcha wept into Cassian's shoulder without either of them commenting on it. Exhaustion and terror, and something else entirely tangled together too completely to separate. Neither of them spoke of that embrace in the days immediately after, both too consumed with Vesper's slow, fragile recovery to examine what had passed between them in the worst hour of the night. But Sorcha found herself replaying it anyway, in the quiet moments between treatments, the steadiness of Cassian's hand around hers, the way he had not once let go until the sun was fully up. She told herself it meant nothing beyond the ordinary comfort 2 exhausted people offered each other in a crisis. She did not entirely believe her own explanation, even as she repeated it to herself each night before sleep finally took her. Vesper's slow recovery over the following days gave Sorcha and Cassian more unguarded hours together than 3 careful years had allowed them, working side by side, through feedings and treatments, with an ease that surprised them both, and somewhere in the middle of that anxious, exhausted week, Cassian told her the truth he had never spoken aloud to anyone in the Corps. I lost a rider named Tobin 5 years ago, he said quietly, watching Vesper's slow, steady breathing in the lantern light. He forced a bond with a dragon that never wanted one, because I signed off on the attempt without asking hard enough whether he'd earned it. I have spent every season since, terrified of approving anything that might cost someone else what it cost him. Sorcha absorbed that confession in silence, understanding, for the first time, the shape of the caution she had spent 3 years mistaking for coldness. That is not the same as what's happening here, she said gently, reaching for his hand without entirely deciding to. Vesper never wanted force. He wanted someone willing to ask first. I think you have spent 5 years so afraid of Tobin's mistake that you stop trusting yourself to tell the difference. Cassian's fingers tightened around hers, and something in his controlled composure, finally, visibly, gave way. I trust the difference when I watch you work, he admitted, low and unsteady. I have watched you kneel beside that dragon in the dark, more nights than I can count this season, breaking every regulation in the book, and I have never once been afraid for your safety, the way I am afraid of everything else in this core. I think some part of me has known for a while that what I feel watching you is not simply respect for a good healer. Sorcha's breath caught, the confession landing somewhere she had not let herself examine too closely all season, and for a long moment neither of them said anything more, the lantern light and Vesper's steady breathing filling the silence between them. I am not asking you to say anything back, Cassian added quietly, when the silence had stretched long enough to feel fragile. I have carried this quietly for longer than I probably should have, and I did not want to keep carrying it without you knowing the truth of it, whatever you choose to do with that truth. Sorcha squeezed his hand, unable yet to find words steady enough to answer him properly, and found that the not answering felt less like avoidance and more like a promise she was not ready to voice aloud, until the danger surrounding them both had finally passed. The reprieve did not last. Lord Ashby, informed that Vesper had somehow survived the poisoning, pushed an emergency vote through the council within the week, demanding immediate culling on the grounds that a dragon now proven unstable enough to require poisoning for public safety could not be permitted to remain. Cassian read the order aloud to Sorcha in the healer's quarters, with a controlled fury that shook in every word. 3 days until the execution squad arrived, and no official channel left to stop it without proof neither of them yet had in hand. We have circumstantial evidence, Cassian said, pacing the small room with the restless energy of a man out of easy solutions. Records that suggest Ashby manipulated the bonding attempts, a poisoning we cannot yet trace to his hand directly. It is not enough to stop a council vote, and I do not have 3 days to find what would be. Sorcha felt the walls of the room pressing in around the plane, unbearable arithmetic of it. A dragon who had never once been the danger everyone insisted he was, 3 days from execution, over a lie neither of them could yet prove. Then we do not wait for enough evidence, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. We put ourselves between the execution squad and Vesper, and we make Ashby's lie impossible to carry out quietly. Someone forging 12 reports and poisoning a dragon does not want witnesses. He wants a clean, official death nobody questions. Cassian stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that mixed fear for her safety with something that looked, unmistakably, like love finally allowed to surface without any more careful restraint holding it back. If we do this, he said, quiet, we do it together, and we do it knowing it could end both our positions in this core permanently. Sorcha took his hand, steady despite everything trembling underneath her calm. I did not become a healer to protect my position, she told him. I became one to protect what deserved protecting. I am not stopping now. They spent that final night before the deadline gathering every scrap of proof they could still reach, Cassian working through core ledgers by lamplight, while Sorcha cross-referenced supplier records for any trace of nightroot purchased outside normal medical channels. And somewhere near dawn, they found it. A single discrete transaction, routed through Lord Ashby's steward 3 weeks before the poisoning, paid for in coin that matched no legitimate core account. It was not the whole case. It was enough, they both agreed, to make a public accusation impossible for the council to simply ignore, and they carried that fragile hope with them into the last exhausted hours before the execution squad was due to arrive. The execution squad arrived at dawn on the 3rd day to find Sorcha and Cassian standing together in front of Vesper's enclosure, unarmed and unmoving, with the full weight of every piece of evidence they had managed to gather in 3 sleepless nights, spread across a table beside them for any council witness willing to actually look. Lord Ashby arrived himself an hour later, furious at the delay, and Cassian met his fury with a calm, devastating recitation of forged bonding logs, a poison purchase traced through a core supplier to Ashby's own steward, and a motive written plainly in 2 years of land petitions filed against Vesper's exact territory. "You are welcome to proceed with the execution," Cassian told the assembled council witnesses, his voice carrying clean across the yard. "But you will do it over evidence of fraud and attempted murder that I have already copied and sent to 3 separate members of the Emperor's court this morning. I would think carefully about whose name ends up attached to covering that evidence up." Ashby's composure cracked for the first time, real fear showing beneath the practiced outrage, and the assembled council witnesses exchanged glances that made clear the tide of the morning had shifted entirely. Vesper, sensing the tension in the yard, rose behind Sorcha and Cassian, with his wings flaring wide, not in aggression, but in the unmistakable posture of something choosing, deliberately, to stand with the 2 people who had spent a season proving they would not abandon him to a convenient lie. The execution squad, watching a dragon hold protective formation around the 2 humans defending him, rather than attacking anyone in the yard, lowered their weapons without needing to be ordered to. Several of the older council witnesses who had voted for the culling looked visibly shaken by the sight, and one of them, an aging woman who had served on the council for 2 decades, crossed the yard afterward to examine the evidence table herself, muttering that she had signed off on the order without ever once reading past the summary page. Sorcha watched the slow, uncomfortable reckoning move through the gathered officials with a grim satisfaction that did not erase the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights, but softened it considerably, knowing that whatever came next, Vesper would not be facing it alone. Lord Ashby was escorted away under guard within the hour, and the council's culling order was quietly withdrawn before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall, leaving Sorcha standing in the settling dust of a morning that had very nearly ended in exactly the death she had spent an entire season fighting to prevent. In the quiet that followed Ashby's arrest, Vesper did something no handler in the Corps had ever recorded him doing in 3 full years of service. He knelt, lowering his enormous body fully to the ground in front of Sorcha, and turned his head to expose the single unmarked scale beneath his jaw that every bonding manual described as the traditional point of offering, freely given rather than taken. Sorcha stared at the gesture with her breath caught somewhere in her chest, understanding exactly what was being offered, and exactly how rare it was for a dragon who had rejected 12 forced attempts to offer it now, entirely on his own terms. "He was never unbondable," Cassian said quietly beside her, watching with an expression of dawning, humbled understanding. He was simply waiting for someone to ask instead of take. 12 riders came at him with ropes and commands. You spent a season kneeling beside him in the dark, asking nothing of him at all. Sorcha reached out with a trembling hand and rested her palm against the offered scale, and felt something ancient and warm settle into place beneath her fingers, a bond forming not through force or ceremony, but through the accumulated weight of an entire season of patient, unhurried care. Vesper made his listening sound, low and resonant, and Sorcha found herself laughing through sudden tears at the sheer, overwhelming relief of an ending she had not fully let herself hope for through 3 sleepless, terrified nights. "I did not do this to earn a bond," she told him, quiet and honest. "I did it because you deserved someone in your corner. Whatever this means now, I want you to know that was always the whole of it." Vesper's great eye held hers, warm and unmistakably grateful, before he finally rose, the traditional bond settled between them, as naturally as anything Sorcha had ever done in her life. Cassian stood a short distance away through the whole of it, giving the moment its full weight without intruding on it, and when Vesper finally rose to his full height, the dragon turned his great head first toward the man who had risked his entire career defending them both, and lowered it once, briefly, in a gesture that needed no manual to translate. Sorcha caught the exchange and felt her heart swell with something too large for the quiet enclosure to hold, understanding that whatever bond had just formed between her and Vesper, it had never been hers to claim alone. Cassian found her an hour later in the quiet of the north enclosure, the whole exhausting, terrifying week finally behind them, and crossed the yard with none of the careful professional distance he had maintained for 3 long years standing between them anymore. "I have spent 3 years telling myself that caution was the same thing as care," he said, stopping close enough that Sorcha had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. Watching you this week taught me they are not the same thing at all, Care asks. Care kneels in the dark and waits. I do not want to spend one more season being careful with you, instead of simply telling you the truth. Then tell me, Sorcha said, quiet, her heart climbing into her throat in a way that had nothing to do with dragons, or councils, or poison at all. Cassian reached for her hand, the same steady gesture that had carried them both through the worst night of the poisoning, and held it like something he never intended to let go of again. I love you, he told her, simple and unguarded in a way 5 careful years had never once let him be. I have loved you long enough that I am ashamed of how many seasons I let caution keep me from saying it. I am not making that mistake any longer. I have read a line from the poet Pablo Neruda, that he loved her without knowing how, or when, or from where, and I think of Sorcha standing in that quiet enclosure, a season of blood and poison and impossible courage, finally settling into something as simple and total as love freely given. She had spent 3 years asking a wounded dragon what he wanted, before ever taking anything from him. Cassian had spent that same season, finally learning to do the same with his own guarded heart. Vesper curled around them both as Sorcha said yes, wings folding close in a gesture that had become, over one unforgettable season, as natural to him as breathing, and Sorcha thought, standing between the dragon she had saved and the man she had finally let herself love without reservation, that every wound she had ever bandaged in her life had somehow, impossibly, led her exactly here. The Corps held a small, informal gathering the following week to mark both Vesper's official bonding and Lord Ashby's quiet removal from the council, and Sorcha stood through the modest celebration with Cassian's hand in hers, watching Vesper accept scratches and attention from handlers who had spent an entire season treating him as a threat to be managed rather than a creature deserving of patience. She thought of her father, gone 8 years now, and hoped, in the private way she allowed herself to hope about such things, that he would have understood at last why she had chosen the side of the wound instead of the side of the weapon. Cassian caught her watching the gathering with tears standing unshed in her eyes, and drew her gently aside from the small crowd, resting his forehead against hers in a rare, unguarded moment neither of them bothered to hide from the others. Whatever comes next for either of us, he murmured, I intend to spend it asking instead of taking, the way you taught an entire season of this Corps to do without ever meaning to teach anyone anything at all. Sorcha laughed softly, leaning into him, and let herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply be happy without bracing for the next wound to bandage.